Some people measure a life by the fortunes they leave behind. Others measure it by the small kindnesses no one else ever notices. Every Friday evening, just before sunset, the same man entered the White Oak Tavern. For 6 years, nothing about that ritual ever changed. He always arrived alone. He always chose the small wooden table beside the rain-streaked window overlooking the cobblestone street. He always removed his weathered leather gloves before sitting down. And when the meal was over, he always left exactly $2 on the table. Not $1, not $3, always $2. Most people thought it was strange. Some called him cheap. Others laughed quietly after he walked away. Emily Carter never joined them. At 24 years old, Emily had worked as a waitress in the White Oak Tavern since losing both of her parents during a harsh winter epidemic. Every sunrise found her sweeping the wooden floors, polishing mugs, and preparing fresh bread long before the first customer stepped inside. By evening, her feet ached, her hands carried the scent of herbs and soup, yet she greeted every guest with the same gentle smile. To Emily, kindness was never something reserved for wealthy customers. It belonged to everyone. That was why she remembered the quiet stranger. Not because of his $2 tip, because he always thanked her before leaving. On this particular Friday, snow drifted lazily outside the tavern windows. The fire inside the great stone hearth crackled warmly, while travelers escaped the freezing wind with bowls of venison stew and fresh bread. The bell above the entrance rang softly. Emily looked up. There he was again. The familiar traveler removed his dark wool cloak, revealing broad shoulders beneath a simple brown tunic. His face carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to difficult decisions, though faint lines around his eyes suggested years of burdens he never shared. No jewelry, no royal colors, nothing that hinted at who he truly was. "Good evening," Emily said with her usual smile. "Your usual table?" He nodded. "If it isn't taken." She laughed quietly. "No one ever sits there on Fridays anymore." He raised one eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because everyone says it belongs to my quiet customer." For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth lifted into a small smile. Emily led him to the window and placed a warm bowl of beef stew before him only minutes later. "Anything else?" He looked at the freshly baked bread. "Only if there's enough for everyone else first." Emily answered without hesitation. "There always is." As she returned to the kitchen, Martha Hill, the tavern manager, shook her head. "You're too good to him." Emily looked confused. "What do you mean?" Martha lowered her voice. 6 years. He orders the cheapest meal. Leaves $2. Never spends another cent. Emily glanced toward the window. The stranger had paused before eating. Instead of reaching for the spoon, he quietly folded his hands as if offering silent gratitude. Then he began his meal. Emily smiled. "Maybe $2 is all he can spare." Martha sighed. "Or maybe he simply doesn't value your service." Emily picked up another tray. "I don't serve people because of what they leave on the table. I serve them because they're hungry." From across the room, the stranger looked up for just a moment. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Yet something in Emily's words seemed to settle quietly inside him. Outside, church bells echoed across the snowy village as dusk settled over the kingdom. The stranger finished every bite of his meal. He reached into the inside pocket of his cloak. For a brief moment, Emily noticed the corner of an old cream-colored envelope before he slipped it back inside. Then, exactly as he had done every Friday for 6 years, he placed 2 crisp $1 bills beneath the empty bowl. Nothing more, nothing less. As he walked toward the door, Emily called after him with a playful smile. "One day you'll have to tell me why it's always exactly $2. The stranger stopped with one hand resting on the wooden door. Without turning around, he answered quietly, "Perhaps on my last visit." Then he stepped into the falling snow. Emily watched him disappear into the white evening, never imagining those simple words would become the beginning of the greatest mystery and the greatest blessing of her entire life. The smallest habits often carry the biggest secrets. The following Friday arrived wrapped in another blanket of snow. Long before sunset, Emily found herself glancing toward the tavern door more often than she cared to admit. She told herself it was only because she expected another busy evening. But deep inside, she knew she was waiting for one particular customer. The quiet man who had promised that one day he would explain the mystery of the $2 tip. Outside, Horses pulled wooden wagons through the snow-covered streets while merchants hurried to close their stalls before darkness settled over the village. Inside the White Oak Tavern, the familiar scent of roasted herbs, fresh bread, and simmering stew filled the warm air. Emily moved gracefully between tables, greeting every traveler with the same kindness that had become part of who she was. An elderly widow who could only afford tea, a family sharing one meal between 4 children, a pair of young soldiers celebrating their safe return. Emily treated every table exactly the same. She never counted kindness according to coins. As twilight painted the windows gold, the bell above the entrance finally rang. Emily instinctively looked up. There he was. The familiar traveler stepped inside, brushing fresh snow from his dark cloak. Their eyes met. She smiled before either of them spoke. Right on time. He removed his gloves and returned the smile. I try not to disappoint people. You've never been late. And you've never forgotten my order. She laughed softly. I don't think I ever could. Without asking, she carried a steaming bowl of beef stew, fresh rye bread, and warm cider to his usual table beside the window. As she placed the tray down, she noticed something different. A cream-colored envelope rested inside his leather satchel. It looked older than the one she had glimpsed the week before. The corners were worn. The wax seal had already been broken. The traveler noticed her eyes lingering for only a brief second. My handwriting gets worse every year, he said with quiet amusement. Emily looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to stare. I know. You've never been curious for the wrong reasons. That answer surprised her. Before she could respond, another customer called her name. A little boy, no older than 8, stood nervously near the entrance with his younger sister hiding behind him. Their clothes were patched. Their boots were soaked from melting snow. Excuse me, miss. The boy lowered his eyes. Could we have some hot water? Emily immediately understood. They had no money for food. Without hesitation, she disappeared into the kitchen. Martha watched her fill 2 bowls with hot stew. What are you doing? They're hungry. They can't pay. Emily simply smiled. They don't have to. She carried the bowls to the children herself. Sit by the fireplace. The bread just came out of the oven. The little girl looked up with wide blue eyes. Really? Emily nodded. As much as you can eat. Across the room, the quiet traveler stopped eating. He watched every moment without saying a word. The children laughed for the first time that evening. Their frozen hands slowly warmed around the wooden bowls. When Emily returned to refill the traveler's cider, she apologized. I'm sorry for keeping you waiting. You weren't. She looked puzzled. You were exactly where you needed to be. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Snow drifted gently beyond the window. The tavern buzzed with quiet conversation. The traveler reached into his satchel once more. This time, he carefully removed a small leather notebook. He wrote only a single sentence before closing it again. Emily caught only 6 words. She never serves kindness selectively. Before leaving, he placed 2 crisp $1 bills beneath the empty bowl, exactly as always. Then, after a brief hesitation, he rested his hand on the worn envelope inside his satchel, almost as if wondering whether tonight should finally be the night. Instead, he quietly slid it back inside. Not yet, he whispered to himself. Emily never heard the words, but something in his eyes told her the answer to the 6-year mystery was drawing closer with every passing Friday. Time has a quiet way of revealing what words never can. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. Then spring gave way to summer. Another year passed. And just as it always had, every Friday evening ended the same way. The bell above the tavern door would ring. Nathaniel Brooks would step inside. Emily would greet him with the same warm smile. He would order the simplest meal on the menu. He would sit beside the same window. And when the evening ended, 2 crisp $1 bills would rest beneath the empty bowl. Nothing about the ritual ever changed. Yet Emily began noticing something else. He was always watching, not in an uncomfortable way, never with curiosity, never with suspicion. He simply observed people. The old blacksmith helping a stranger repair a broken wagon. A young mother comforting her crying baby. An exhausted traveler sharing his bread with an injured dog waiting outside. Sometimes Nathaniel barely touched his own meal before quietly studying moments everyone else ignored. One Friday afternoon, a heavy storm rolled across the valley without warning. Rain hammered against the tavern windows while thunder echoed through the mountains. Business was unusually slow. Only a handful of customers sought shelter inside. Emily was drying wooden mugs when the door burst open. A tall man dressed in expensive clothes stepped inside, accompanied by two well-dressed companions. His polished boots splashed muddy water across the clean floor. Without even looking at Emily, he snapped his fingers. "You." She walked over politely. "Good evening, sir. I want the best wine. We're temporarily out of that vintage," but he cut her off. "Then bring whatever costs the most." Emily nodded calmly. "Of course." From his usual table, Nathaniel quietly watched the exchange. The wealthy customer spent the next hour complaining about every dish placed before him. The soup was too warm. The bread was too hard. The meat was too dry. Each complaint grew louder than the last. Finally, he slammed his cup onto the table. "This place survives because customers like me spend real money." He glanced toward Nathaniel's table and laughed. Unlike some people, several guests turned toward the quiet traveler. "He probably leaves pennies for tips." One of the man's companions chuckled. "I've seen beggars with deeper pockets." Emily's smile disappeared for the first time that evening. She set down the tray she was carrying. Then she spoke with surprising confidence. "Sir, the value of a guest isn't measured by the size of a tip." The wealthy customer frowned. "What did you say?" Emily met his eyes. "I said everyone who enters this tavern deserves respect, whether they spend 2 coins or 200. The room fell completely silent. Martha's face turned pale. She feared Emily had just lost her job. The customer stood abruptly. "You dare lecture me?" Emily didn't step backward. "My parents taught me that kindness should never have a price. If that's a mistake, I'll gladly keep making it." For several tense seconds, no one moved. Then, without another word, the wealthy customer threw a handful of silver coins onto the table and stormed out into the rain. His companions hurried after him. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Emily slowly bent down and picked up every scattered coin. Instead of putting them into her apron, she carried them to the donation box near the entrance, a wooden chest used to buy meals for hungry children during winter. Nathaniel watched every step. His expression never changed, but his eyes softened. When Emily returned to refill his cup, she smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry you had to witness that." He looked at the small donation box near the door. "No, I'm grateful that I did." Before leaving that evening, Nathaniel reached into his satchel once more. Emily expected to see the familiar leather notebook. Instead, she noticed something she had never seen before. There were dozens of carefully preserved $2 bills bundled together inside the worn envelope. Each one carried neat handwriting across the edge. Before she could read a single word, Nathaniel gently closed the envelope and slipped it back into his cloak. He placed his usual $2 beneath the bowl. Then he quietly whispered to himself with a faint smile. "Just a little longer." Emily never asked about the envelope again. But for the first time in 6 years, she realized the mystery was never about the money. It was about something he had been carefully collecting all along. Not every promise is spoken aloud. Some are kept in silence for years. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings and golden leaves drifting across the village square. The White Oak Tavern remained as lively as ever, welcoming merchants, farmers, travelers, and wandering musicians seeking warmth before winter returned. For Emily, life followed its familiar rhythm. She greeted strangers by name whenever she could remember them. She carried heavy trays without complaint. She listened more than she spoke. And every Friday evening, she quietly reserved the table beside the window without telling anyone why. No one questioned it anymore. Everyone simply knew that table belonged to the mysterious traveler. Nathaniel Brooks arrived just as the church bell struck 6. As always, he entered without escort, wearing the same weathered cloak that revealed nothing about the wealth or authority he might possess. Emily welcomed him with a smile that had become effortless over the years. "I was beginning to think the rain might delay you." Nathaniel brushed droplets from his shoulders. "I've learned that some places are worth arriving on time for." She laughed softly. "And here I thought it was only the stew." "The stew helps." As she placed his meal before him, she noticed he looked more tired than usual. The faint shadows beneath his eyes were deeper. His shoulders seemed heavier. For the first time in years, he barely touched the bread. Instead, he stared quietly through the rain-covered window. Emily hesitated before speaking. "Long week." Nathaniel looked back at her. "The longest." She considered asking another question, but stopped herself. Some people carried burdens they weren't ready to share. Instead, she simply poured fresh cider into his cup. No charge. He raised an eyebrow. You'll get in trouble. I'll tell Martha it accidentally spilled into your mug. That earned another rare smile. You've become quite brave. Only with regular customers. Their quiet conversation ended when the tavern door suddenly flew open. A soaked courier stumbled inside, breathing heavily while clutching a leather satchel against his chest. Is there anyone here who can read? Several customers looked away. Few villagers could read official documents. Emily stepped forward. My father taught me. The courier handed her a rain-soaked letter. The bridge north of the valley collapsed. 3 wagons are stranded. They need supplies before morning. Emily carefully unfolded the damaged parchment. Several words had blurred in the rain, but enough remained to understand the message. She immediately turned toward Martha. We have extra bread from today, and smoked meat. If we pack everything now, someone can leave before midnight. Martha frowned. We'll lose money. Emily answered gently. If we don't send it, they may lose their lives. Without another word, Emily removed her apron, gathered baskets of bread, dried fruit, blankets, and preserved meat, then began loading everything into empty crates. To her surprise, customers slowly stood from their tables. The old blacksmith offered his wagon. A farmer donated sacks of potatoes. The traveling musicians contributed blankets. Even children began carrying supplies toward the door. Nathaniel watched the entire scene in silence. Not because Emily had asked anyone to help. She never had. People simply followed her example. An hour later, the wagon disappeared into the rainy night. The tavern felt strangely peaceful afterward. Emily returned to Nathaniel's table, exhausted. I'm sorry. I completely forgot your dessert. He shook his head. I've never felt better served. She looked confused. But you hardly ate. I wasn't hungry for food tonight. He reached into his satchel once more. Emily expected the familiar notebook. Instead, he quietly removed the worn envelope again. This time, he opened it just enough for himself to look inside. Folded carefully within were dozens of old $2 bills. Beside each bill rested a handwritten note. He read one silently before closing the envelope again. Emily caught only a glimpse of a single sentence. She always chose people over profit. Nathaniel slipped the envelope back into his satchel. Then he placed 2 fresh $1 bills beneath his empty bowl, exactly as he had done every Friday for nearly 6 years. As he rose to leave, Emily smiled. I still don't know why it's always $2. Nathaniel paused at the doorway. His voice was calm, almost nostalgic. Because someday, you'll understand why every one of them mattered. The door closed behind him. Emily stood quietly beside the window, watching his figure disappear into the rain once again. For reasons she couldn't explain, she suddenly felt that the answer to the mystery was no longer far away, and whatever waited inside that weathered envelope was destined to change both of their lives forever. The answers we search for often arrive on the day we stop expecting them. Nearly 6.5 years had passed since Nathaniel Brooks first walked into the White Oak Tavern. The seasons had painted the village in every color imaginable. Snow had buried the rooftops. Spring flowers had climbed the stone walls. Summer festivals had filled the square with music. Autumn leaves had danced across the old cobblestones. Through every season, one thing had remained unchanged. Every Friday, one simple meal, one quiet conversation, $2 beneath an empty bowl. By now, the ritual had become part of the tavern itself. Even new customers knew not to sit at the table beside the window. They called it the Friday table. Emily never corrected them. One cold evening, just before the first snowfall of winter, Nathaniel arrived later than usual. The church bell had already struck 7. Emily immediately noticed something different. His steps were slower. His shoulders seemed unusually heavy. Tiny strands of silver had begun appearing in his dark hair. Time had touched him more than she realized. You worried me, Emily admitted as she guided him to his usual seat. I almost thought you weren't coming. Nathaniel smiled faintly. I promised I'd explain everything on my last visit. I couldn't leave before keeping that promise. Emily laughed. So this isn't your last visit? He looked out the window for several quiet seconds. I don't know. Those 3 words lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. She placed his familiar meal before him. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence between them had never been uncomfortable. It had become the language of old friends. Finally, Nathaniel broke it. Emily, do you remember the first day we met? She smiled. You ordered beef stew. You left $2. You thanked me, and I thought you looked lonely. He chuckled softly. That sounds about right. And do you remember what you said when Martha complained about my tips? Emily nodded almost immediately. I said people shouldn't be judged by what they leave on the table. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. I've carried those words with me ever since. Emily frowned slightly. You make it sound important. It was. Before she could ask why, a loud crash echoed across the tavern. A young serving boy had accidentally dropped an entire tray of food onto the floor. Bowls shattered. Stew splashed across the wooden planks. The frightened teenager froze in place. I'm sorry. Several customers sighed with annoyance. Martha hurried over, clearly frustrated. Do you know how expensive that was? The boy's hands trembled. I'll work without pay. Emily stepped between them before Martha could continue. It was an accident. I'll clean everything. And today's wages can come from mine. The boy looked at her in disbelief. You don't have to. I know. She knelt on the floor, gathering broken pieces without the slightest irritation. Within moments, something remarkable happened. One customer stood and helped wipe the floor. Another gathered the broken dishes. A farmer brought fresh towels. Even Martha's expression softened. The entire tavern quietly worked together until everything looked as though nothing had happened. Nathaniel watched every second. He didn't touch his meal. Instead, he slowly reached into his satchel. This time, he removed the worn envelope completely. He held it in both hands for a long moment. Then he gently traced the edges with his thumb. Emily returned after finishing the cleanup. I'm sorry. You had to wait again. Nathaniel looked directly at her. I've never been waiting. His voice was calm, almost emotional. I've been watching. He carefully slipped the envelope back inside his satchel one final time. Not because he had changed his mind, but because, somehow, he knew the right moment had still not arrived. As he stood to leave, he placed the familiar $2 tip beneath the bowl. Then, for the first time in more than 6 years, he quietly added something else. A small brass key. Emily stared at it in confusion. What is this? Nathaniel smiled, his eyes carrying both gratitude and sadness. A promise. Keep it safe. When the time comes, you'll know exactly which door it was meant to open. Before Emily could ask another question, he pulled his cloak around his shoulders and disappeared into the snowy night, leaving the tiny brass key beside the 2 crisp $1 bills, and leaving Emily with more questions than she had ever carried before. Some letters are written with ink. Others are written by fate long before anyone opens them. The following Friday came. Emily arrived at the White Oak Tavern earlier than usual. She unlocked the front door, swept the wooden floor, polished every table, and arranged fresh wildflowers beneath the window where Nathaniel always sat. Yet her attention kept drifting toward the small brass key resting safely inside her apron pocket. She had examined it dozens of times throughout the week. It was old, beautifully crafted. Its handle carried the shape of an oak leaf. But there were no markings, no initials, no clue about what it unlocked. Nathaniel's final words echoed constantly inside her mind. When the time comes, you'll know exactly which door it was meant to open. She wanted answers, but she had promised herself she would never chase them. If Nathaniel wished to explain, he would. If not, she would simply keep the key safe. Evening slowly settled over the village. One by one, familiar customers filled the tavern. The old blacksmith, the schoolteacher, the widow who always ordered mint tea. Everyone arrived, except Nathaniel. Emily looked toward the entrance each time the bell rang. Each time, someone else walked through the door. 7 o'clock passed, then 8. For the first Friday in more than 6 years, his chair remained empty. Martha noticed Emily glancing toward the window again. Still waiting, Emily forced a smile. He may have been delayed. Martha gently rested a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes life changes without warning. Emily nodded, though something deep inside her refused to believe he would simply disappear. Closing time finally arrived. The last customer left. Emily quietly cleared Nathaniel's untouched table. For the first time in years, there were no 2 $1 bills waiting beneath the empty bowl. Only silence. Just as she reached for the bowl, the tavern door opened one final time. A middle-aged lawyer wearing a dark wool coat stepped inside. Excuse me. I'm looking for Miss Emily Carter. She looked surprised. That's me. The man removed a sealed envelope from his leather case. It was left in my care, with very specific instructions. He told me to deliver it only if Mr. Nathaniel Brooks failed to appear here on a Friday evening. Emily felt her heart skip. Is he? The lawyer lowered his eyes. Mr. Brooks passed away peacefully 3 days ago. The tavern became completely still. Even the fire seemed quieter. Emily couldn't speak. She accepted the envelope with trembling hands. On the front, written in the same careful handwriting she had seen years before, were only 6 words. For the waitress who never changed. Tears blurred her vision before she even broke the seal. Inside rested a folded letter, and beneath it, every single $2 bill Nathaniel had ever left over 6.5 years. Each bill had been carefully dated, each one perfectly preserved, each one accompanied by a handwritten note. Emily unfolded the first. Week 1. She smiled before seeing my clothes. The second. Week 9. She fed a hungry child before serving paying customers. Another. Year 2. She defended a stranger everyone mocked. Another. Year 4. She chose honesty over profit. Another. Year 6. She still treats every guest exactly the same. There were hundreds of notes, hundreds of memories. Nathaniel had not been collecting money. He had been collecting proof. Proof that genuine kindness could survive year after year without expecting recognition. At the very bottom of the envelope rested one final letter addressed only to Emily. Her tears fell onto the page before she could read the first line. The lawyer quietly spoke. He asked me to tell you one more thing. Emily slowly looked up. He said, if she still carries the key, tell her it's finally time to open the door. The lawyer reached into his coat and carefully placed an old property deed onto the table. Across the top, written in elegant script, were the words that left Emily completely speechless. The Brooks Family Foundation. And beneath it, White Oak House. The matching keyhole was waiting for the small brass key that had been resting in her pocket all along. A person's true legacy is never hidden inside a fortune. It lives inside the hearts they quietly changed. The following morning, Emily stood before the iron gates of White Oak House. She had walked past the elegant estate countless times during her life. Children often wondered who lived behind its towering stone walls. Villagers whispered stories about a wealthy family that had disappeared years ago. No one had ever entered. Until now, the brass key felt strangely warm inside her hand. The lawyer, Daniel Foster, stood quietly beside her. You don't have to do this today, he said gently. Emily looked at the heavy oak doors beyond the garden. I think he waited 6 years. I shouldn't make him wait another day. She slipped the small brass key into the ancient lock. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the mechanism clicked softly. The massive doors slowly opened inward. Dust floated through the morning sunlight as though the house itself had been patiently waiting. Emily stepped inside. Everything remained exactly as Nathaniel had left it. Books lined towering wooden shelves. A firewood basket still rested beside the stone fireplace. Fresh flowers had long since dried inside crystal vases. Nothing suggested abandonment. Only silence. Daniel smiled faintly. He instructed the caretakers never to change anything. He said one day, the right person would arrive. Emily slowly walked through the entrance hall. Every room reflected remarkable simplicity. No golden statues. No extravagant furniture. No unnecessary luxury. Instead, maps, books, children's drawings framed along the hallway, letters carefully tied together with blue ribbons. Nathaniel had surrounded himself with memories rather than treasures. As they entered his private study, Emily suddenly stopped. An enormous wooden cabinet covered one wall. Inside were hundreds of neatly labeled journals. Each carried a single year. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3, all the way through Year 6. Daniel carefully removed the first volume. He wanted you to read these. Emily opened the journal with trembling hands. The very first page carried a familiar date. The day Nathaniel first entered the White Oak Tavern. His handwriting was calm and precise. I visited another village today. My advisors recommended I wear ordinary clothes. They said people only reveal their true character when they believe no one important is watching. Emily turned the page. I found a small tavern. A young waitress smiled before noticing how little I ordered. Interesting. Another page. Week 4. She carried food outside for an elderly traveler after finishing her shift. She never asked for payment. Another. Year 1. The tavern manager complained about my $2 tip. Emily defended me without knowing my name. Tears quietly rolled down Emily's cheeks. Every page held another memory she had almost forgotten. The hungry children, the frightened serving boy, the broken bridge, the lonely widow. Small moments, ordinary moments, moments she had never imagined anyone remembered. Nathaniel had remembered every single one. Daniel gently placed another leather journal onto the desk. This one is different. Emily opened it carefully. Instead of observations, she found names. Hundreds of names. Waitresses, maids, stable workers, orphans, widows. Beside each name appeared notes. Education funded. Medical care provided. Home rebuilt. Scholarship granted. Emily looked at Daniel in confusion. What is this? He smiled. The Brooks Family Foundation. For years, Nathaniel secretly used his personal fortune to help ordinary people. He believed kingdoms became stronger when ordinary families became stronger. Emily slowly looked around the study. So why me? Daniel answered without hesitation. Because after watching you for 6 years, he believed you understood that better than anyone. He walked toward the large window overlooking the village. There is one final room. He specifically instructed that only you could enter it. Emily followed him down a quiet hallway. At the very end stood another wooden door. Unlike the others, its lock matched the brass key perfectly. Above the doorway hung a carved wooden plaque. Only 4 simple words had been engraved into the oak. Kindness changes every kingdom. Emily gently held the brass key once again. Her heart raced. Somewhere behind that final door, Nathaniel had left the last piece of the promise he had spent 6 years preparing just for her. The greatest gifts are never the ones we receive. They are the ones that trust us to change someone else's future. Emily stood before the final oak door with the brass key resting in her trembling hand. For a long moment, she simply stared at the carved words. Kindness changes every kingdom. She took a slow breath and slipped the key into the lock. The mechanism turned effortlessly. The door opened with a quiet creak. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating a room unlike any she had ever imagined. There was no treasure, no mountain of gold, no royal jewels. Instead, hundreds of neatly organized shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Each shelf held carefully labeled wooden boxes. Every box carried the name of a village somewhere in the kingdom. Beside them rested ledgers, letters, maps, and children's drawings. At the center of the room stood a large oak desk. On top of it waited a single cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, in Nathaniel's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Emily, if you chose to open this door." With tears already forming, she gently broke the seal. Inside rested one handwritten letter. She began reading aloud. "Dear Emily, if these words have reached you, then my journey has ended, but yours is only beginning. People will tell you I was a king. History may remember my victories. Some will remember my crown. I hope none of those things matter to you. I hope you remember me as the quiet man who enjoyed your beef stew every Friday." Emily smiled through her tears. Daniel quietly stepped back, allowing her to continue. "I never left $2 because it was all I could afford, nor because I wished to test you. The $2 were a promise I made to myself. Every week you reminded me that goodness still existed. Every week I left $2 so I would never forget the lesson I learned inside your tavern. Those bills became my journal. Proof that kindness can remain unchanged even while kingdoms do not." Emily paused to wipe away another tear. She continued reading. "This room belongs to the Brooks Family Foundation. For years it has quietly served widows, waitresses, stable hands, orphaned children, struggling families, and forgotten villages. But every organization eventually needs more than money. It needs a heart. After watching you for 6 years, I found that heart. Not because you were extraordinary, because you never tried to be. You simply chose compassion every ordinary day." Emily lowered the letter for a moment. The room was completely silent. Daniel's eyes glistened. She unfolded the final page. "Everything inside this house now belongs to the foundation. Everything within the foundation now belongs to your care. Do not use it to honor my name. Use it to protect the people whose names history will never remember. If one hungry child smiles because of this work, then every Friday evening was worthwhile." Signed, Nathaniel Brooks. Emily gently folded the letter against her heart. Daniel finally spoke. "There is something else." He opened one of the wooden ledgers. Inside were financial records unlike anything Emily had ever imagined. Scholarships, village clinics, food programs, winter shelters, emergency grain reserves. Hundreds of ongoing projects spread across the kingdom. Nathaniel had spent years building a network that quietly helped thousands of ordinary people without ever revealing its true benefactor. Emily looked overwhelmed. I don't know how to lead something this large. Daniel smiled kindly. He knew you would say that. From inside the desk, he removed one final note. It contained only a single sentence. You already have. Emily frowned. I don't understand. Daniel looked toward the tavern visible in the distance through the window. For 6 years, you led without titles. You inspired strangers to help one another. You changed hearts before you ever changed lives. Emily slowly understood. Nathaniel had never chosen her because she was the most experienced. He had chosen her because every act of kindness she offered had quietly inspired someone else to do the same. At that moment, she realized the true inheritance was never the house, the foundation, or the fortune. It was the responsibility to ensure that one simple act of compassion would continue spreading from one ordinary person to another, long after both she and Nathaniel were gone. A single act of kindness may begin with one person, but its echo can outlive generations. 3 months passed after Emily accepted responsibility for the Brooks Family Foundation. Her life changed completely, yet in the ways that mattered most. She remained exactly the same. Every Monday morning, she reviewed requests from struggling villages. Every Tuesday, she visited schools supported by the foundation. Every Wednesday, she met physicians opening new rural clinics. Every Thursday, she traveled to isolated farming communities where harvests had failed. And every Friday evening, she returned to the White Oak Tavern, not because she needed the work, but because she never wanted to forget the place where everything had begun. Martha laughed the first time Emily tied on her old apron again. You own one of the largest charitable foundations in the kingdom, and you're still serving stew. Emily smiled as she carried a tray toward a family seated near the fireplace. This apron reminds me who I am. It always will. The tavern had changed very little. The wooden floors still creaked. The fireplace still warmed every corner. Children still laughed while chasing one another outside. The only noticeable difference rested beside the window. Nathaniel's favorite table remained untouched. Emily had placed a small vase of fresh wildflowers there every Friday since his passing. No customer ever asked to sit there. Without speaking about it, the village had quietly agreed. Some seats deserved to remain filled by memory. One snowy evening, as Emily finished serving supper, a nervous young waitress accidentally bumped into her. The tray slipped. Bowls crashed onto the floor. The frightened girl immediately burst into tears. I'm so sorry. I'll repay everything. Emily recognized the fear instantly. Years earlier, she had seen the same terrified expression on the young serving boy's face. Without hesitation, Emily knelt beside the broken dishes. It's all right. No one was hurt. She smiled warmly. Let's clean it together. Several customers immediately stood. A farmer fetched a broom. An elderly woman gathered the broken bowls. A merchant helped wipe away the spilled stew. Within moments, the entire tavern worked side by side. Emily quietly watched them. No one had been asked. No one expected payment. Kindness had become contagious. Martha leaned close and whispered with a smile, "You've noticed it too." Emily nodded. They're doing exactly what Nathaniel hoped people would do. That evening, after closing, Daniel Foster arrived carrying another leather box. I found this while organizing the archives. It belongs to you. Emily carefully opened it. Inside rested the first pair of $1 bills Nathaniel had ever left beneath his bowl. Unlike the others, these were framed beneath clear glass. Attached was a small handwritten card, the beginning of the promise. Below it rested another folded note addressed to Emily. She unfolded it slowly. If you are reading this, then you have already succeeded. Not because the foundation became larger, not because more money was given away, because somewhere, someone chose kindness after witnessing yours. That has always been the true measure of leadership. Emily gently closed her eyes. The words felt less like goodbye, and more like a conversation continuing across time. The following week, the foundation opened its newest community center in a small mountain village. Emily refused to allow the building to carry Nathaniel's name. Instead, Carved above the entrance were simple words every visitor could understand. Leave every person better than you found them. When the ceremony ended, a little boy approached her shyly. He held two wrinkled $1 bills tightly in his small hand. I want to help too. Emily knelt until they were eye level. You don't have to give everything you have. The boy smiled. My grandfather said someone once changed the kingdom with only $2. Emily felt tears gather once more. She accepted the little gift with both hands. It isn't the amount that changes the world. It's the love behind it. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills, Emily looked toward the distant road leading back to the White Oak Tavern. Years ago, a quiet stranger had walked through its door carrying nothing more than a simple smile, an ordinary meal, and two $1 bills. She had believed she was serving him. Only now did she fully understand the truth. All along, Nathaniel Brooks had been teaching an entire kingdom that greatness is never measured by power, wealth, or titles. It is measured by the quiet decision to treat every person with dignity, even when no one is watching. And because one waitress chose kindness over convenience on countless ordinary days, thousands of extraordinary lives would forever be changed. The strongest traditions are not the ones we inherit. They are the ones we choose to continue. 5 years quietly passed. The kingdom had changed in countless ways. New schools stood where abandoned buildings had once crumbled. Village clinics welcomed families who had never before seen a physician. Food storehouses ensured that harsh winters no longer brought hunger to isolated communities. The Brooks Family Foundation had grown beyond anything Nathaniel had imagined. Yet anyone who asked Emily about its greatest achievement always received the same answer. It isn't the buildings. It isn't the donations. It's the people. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emily traveled to a small mountain village to attend the opening of another community library. Children lined both sides of the road, laughing as they waved handmade banners. Elderly couples greeted her with warm smiles. Farmers removed their hats as she passed. Emily greeted every person by name whenever she could. Titles had never impressed her. People always had. After the ceremony ended, an elderly woman approached carrying a faded cloth pouch. I've waited years to give this to you. Emily accepted it carefully. Inside rested two old $1 bills. They were worn nearly white with age. My husband received help from the foundation during the terrible winter. He kept these until the day he died. Emily looked up gently. Why didn't he spend them? The woman smiled through tears. He said they reminded him that kindness always comes back. He wanted someone else to begin their own promise. Emily held the fragile bills with extraordinary care. By evening, she returned to the White Oak Tavern. The building looked almost exactly as it had years before. The same wooden sign, the same warm light shining through the windows, the same welcoming smell of fresh bread. Martha had retired 2 years earlier. She now spent most afternoons teaching young servers the importance of hospitality. Emily still visited every Friday, not because anyone expected her, because she expected it of herself. As she entered, she noticed a young waitress nervously serving tables. She looked no older than 18. Her hands shook each time she carried a tray. Several impatient travelers criticized her for moving too slowly. Emily quietly watched from across the room. The young woman apologized again and again. No one offered encouragement. Emily remembered herself. Without revealing her identity, she took an empty seat beside the window. The waitress approached carefully. I'm sorry for the wait. We're short-staffed tonight. Emily smiled. You don't need to apologize. You've been working very hard. The young waitress blinked with surprise. No customer had said anything kind to her all evening. Emily ordered a simple bowl of beef stew, the same meal Nathaniel had chosen every Friday. When supper ended, she quietly reached into her pocket. She placed two crisp $1 bills beneath the bowl. Then she stood and walked toward the door. The waitress hurried after her. Ma'am, you forgot your change. Emily turned with a gentle smile. No, I left exactly what I intended. The young woman looked confused. It isn't very much. Emily nodded. It never was. She smiled warmly before stepping outside beneath the evening sky. The waitress slowly returned to clear the table. As she lifted the empty bowl, she discovered a folded note resting beneath the two bills. With trembling hands, she opened it. Only one sentence had been written across the page. Never underestimate what a small act of kindness can become. The young waitress read the words 3 times. She carefully folded the note and placed it inside her apron pocket. Watching quietly from across the village square, Emily smiled to herself. She recognized the same spark Nathaniel had once seen inside her. A single encouraging sentence. A simple meal. 2 ordinary $1 bills. The promise had begun again. Not because someone commanded it. Not because tradition demanded it. But because compassion had quietly found another heart willing to carry it forward. And somewhere beyond memory, Emily liked to believe Nathaniel Brooks would have smiled, knowing that the smallest gift he had ever given had become a legacy no passage of time could ever erase. Kindness does not end with the person who gives it. It quietly becomes part of everyone who receives it. Another 7 years slipped by almost unnoticed. The Brooks Family Foundation had become one of the kingdom's most respected charitable organizations. Yet very few people knew the name of its founder. That was exactly how Nathaniel would have wanted it. Emily had refused statues. She had declined ceremonies. She rejected every proposal to rename villages, schools, or clinics after either herself or Nathaniel. The work matters, she always said. The names do not. One bright spring morning, Emily traveled to a newly completed boarding school for children from remote mountain villages. The classrooms buzzed with excitement. Books filled every shelf. Sunlight streamed through wide windows. Children laughed freely in hallways built where only empty fields had existed a decade earlier. As Emily quietly observed from the back of a classroom, the teacher asked a simple question. Can anyone tell me what kindness means? Several small hands immediately shot into the air. A little girl stood first. It means helping someone. Another child smiled. It means sharing. A boy near the window thought for a long moment before speaking. It means doing good things when nobody is watching. Emily froze. Those words. She had heard them once before. Nathaniel had spoken something almost identical years ago while finishing his Friday supper. The teacher nodded proudly. Excellent. But where did you learn that? The boy reached into his school bag. Carefully, he removed a small wooden frame. Inside rested 2 faded $1 bills. Emily felt her heart tighten. My grandmother gave them to me. She said a kind king once changed someone's life with these. I keep them because they remind me what really matters. Several other children immediately reached into their own bags. One displayed a handwritten note. Another carried a tiny brass coin. One girl showed an old recipe card from the White Oak Tavern. Every keepsake represented a story. Every story traced back to someone whose life had quietly been touched by the foundation. Emily suddenly realized something extraordinary. Nathaniel's promise had spread farther than either of them had ever imagined. Not through speeches, not through laws, but through stories passed from grandparents to children. After the lesson ended, the teacher approached Emily. We've created a tradition. Emily smiled. What kind? Every new student spends one afternoon each month helping someone in the community. No rewards. No grades. They simply learn that kindness grows stronger when it is practiced. Emily looked around the cheerful classroom. Children were already laughing together while organizing books for younger students. No one instructed them. They simply helped because helping had become normal. That evening, Emily returned once again to White Oak House. She walked slowly into Nathaniel's study. Everything remained almost unchanged. The journals still lined the shelves. The maps still covered the walls. His favorite reading chair still rested beside the fireplace. Emily carefully removed the very first journal. She reread the opening sentence. I visited another village today. She smiled softly. So did I. She pulled a blank leather journal from the desk drawer. For years, she had resisted adding her own words beside Nathaniel's. Tonight felt different. She opened the first page and began writing. Today I learned that kindness has a longer memory than people do. Children now repeat lessons they never knew you taught. Your $2 promise has become thousands of promises carried by strangers who will never know your name. She paused, then added one final sentence. You were right, Nathaniel. Compassion really can change an entire kingdom. Emily gently closed the journal and returned it beside Nathaniel's originals. One collection had recorded how a quiet king discovered hope inside an ordinary tavern. The other would continue recording how that hope never stopped growing. Outside the study window, the lights of distant villages flickered beneath the evening sky. Each tiny light represented another family, another child, another act of quiet generosity, another story still waiting to be written. And somewhere within those countless ordinary lives, the legacy of two simple $1 bills continued to travel from one grateful heart to another, proving that the smallest gifts often become the longest remembered. Legacies are not measured by how long people remember our names. They are measured by how long they continue our kindness. 25 years had passed since Nathaniel Brooks first walked into the White Oak Tavern carrying nothing more than a quiet smile and two $1 bills. The kingdom looked almost unrecognizable. Roads connected villages that had once been isolated. Schools welcomed every child regardless of wealth. Small clinics stood in places where families had once traveled days to receive care. Most people believed these changes had happened naturally. Very few knew they all traced back to one ordinary waitress and one extraordinary promise. Emily's hair had begun to silver at the temples. Fine lines surrounded her warm eyes. But her smile remained exactly as it had been on the day Nathaniel first met her. Every Friday evening, without exception, she still visited the White Oak Tavern. The building had been carefully restored over the years. Nothing modern replaced its old wooden beams. Nothing expensive altered its welcoming atmosphere. Visitors often traveled from distant villages simply to experience the place where the famous story had begun. Most left surprised. There were no statues, no museum displays, no grand speeches, only good food, friendly service, and people treating one another with quiet respect. One autumn afternoon, a young journalist arrived hoping to write a book about the Brooks Family Foundation. He politely approached Emily as she finished arranging fresh flowers on Nathaniel's favorite table. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I've interviewed ministers, governors, teachers, and historians. They all say the same thing. You changed the kingdom." Emily smiled gently. "No, we changed it." The journalist looked confused. There wasn't anyone else here. Emily glanced toward the empty chair beside the window. "There always was." He followed her gaze. "You still believe he's with you?" Emily considered the question carefully. "I believe every kind choice he inspired is still with us." She touched the small vase of wildflowers. "That's enough." The journalist opened his notebook. "If readers remember only one lesson from your life, what should it be?" Emily remained silent for several moments. Then she quietly answered, "Never decide someone's worth by what they can give you. Sometimes the quietest stranger is carrying the greatest gift." The young writer slowly lowered his pen. He realized no sentence he could create would ever sound wiser than the one she had just spoken. Several days later, the foundation celebrated its 50th anniversary. Representatives from every village gathered inside the largest community hall ever built through Nathaniel's vision. Teachers, doctors, farmers, builders, former orphans, former patients, former students. Thousands of lives filled the hall. Each carried a story connected to another act of kindness. As Emily stepped onto the stage, the audience rose together in complete silence. Not because tradition required it, because gratitude did. She looked across the sea of familiar faces. Some she had known for decades. Others had never met her before. Yet all of them belonged to the same invisible family. She placed a small wooden frame onto the podium. Inside rested the original two $1 bills Nathaniel had left beneath his bowl all those years ago. The hall remained perfectly quiet. Emily smiled softly. "I've been asked many times why we never spend these. They could buy almost nothing." She gently touched the glass. "They were never meant to purchase food. They purchased hope." A young girl sitting in the front row slowly stood. She couldn't have been older than 10. "My mother says kindness grows when someone believes another person deserves it." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother is very wise." The little girl smiled. "She learned it from her grandmother. And her grandmother learned it from you." Emily looked around the hall. Generation after generation had quietly carried the same lesson forward. Not because anyone forced them, because love had always been easier to pass on than fear. As the evening came to an end, Emily carefully returned the framed bills to their place beside Nathaniel's journal. Outside, hundreds of lanterns illuminated the peaceful streets. Children laughed. Families walked together. Neighbors greeted strangers as friends. The kingdom had not become perfect. No kingdom ever could. But it had become kinder. And in the end, that was the greatest inheritance Nathaniel Brooks and one ordinary waitress could ever have left behind. The world rarely remembers the exact day a great legacy begins. It simply wakes up one morning and realizes kindness has become part of everyday life. Many years later, when Emily Carter's own journey quietly came to its peaceful end, the kingdom mourned not only the woman she had been, but the example she had lived every single day. There was no royal funeral, no extravagant procession, no towering monument carved from marble. Those had never been her wishes. Instead, thousands of ordinary people gathered outside the White Oak Tavern on a calm Friday evening. Farmers stood beside teachers. Doctors stood beside blacksmiths. Former orphans embraced families they had built because someone once believed in them. No one had been ordered to attend. They simply came. The small table beside the window remained exactly where it had always been. Fresh wildflowers rested inside the familiar glass vase. On the polished wooden surface sat two carefully framed $1 bills beside a simple handwritten note. Kindness begins with one ordinary choice. As sunset painted the village in warm shades of gold, Daniel Foster, now an elderly man himself, stepped quietly before the crowd. His hands trembled as he opened one final journal. Unlike Nathaniel's journals, unlike Emily's journals, this one had been written collectively over many years by people whose lives had been changed through the foundation. Daniel read only a few passages. A stranger paid for my daughter's education. A warm meal saved my family during the hardest winter. Someone believed in me before I believed in myself. A waitress taught me that dignity belongs to everyone. The crowd listened in complete silence. Not a single story mentioned wealth. Not one celebrated power. Every page spoke only of compassion. When Daniel closed the journal, he smiled through tears. I once asked Nathaniel Brooks why he never revealed himself. He answered with words I never forgot. Daniel looked toward the empty chair beside the window. If people are kind only because they know a king is watching, then they have learned nothing at all. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the tavern kitchen. For a brief moment, it felt as though nothing had changed. Children still laughed in the village square. Travelers still sought shelter inside the White Oak Tavern. Young waitresses still welcomed strangers with genuine smiles. Life continued, exactly as Emily would have wanted. As darkness slowly settled across the kingdom, a little boy wandered toward Nathaniel's old table. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old. His mother started to call him back. Daniel gently shook his head. Let him. The boy carefully reached into his pocket. He placed two slightly wrinkled $1 bills beneath the framed pair. Then he whispered softly, My grandfather told me this is where hope lives. Without waiting for praise, he quietly returned to his family. Several people smiled. Others wiped away tears. No one had taught the child to perform a ceremony. He had simply continued a tradition passed lovingly from one generation to the next. Daniel quietly looked toward the evening sky. I think they would both be proud. Nearby, the church bell rang exactly as it had every Friday for decades. Its familiar sound drifted across peaceful streets where neighbors greeted one another by name, where no hungry child was turned away, and where countless ordinary people still chose kindness without expecting recognition. Long after the crowd had gone home, the tavern owner extinguished the final lantern. Only the candle beside Nathaniel's table continued to burn. Its small flame reflected softly against the glass, protecting the 4 $1 bills now resting together. 2 from the quiet king, 2 from a little boy who had never met him. Between them stretched a lifetime of compassion that no passage of time could erase. And so the story that began with a simple bowl of stew, a quiet smile, and a $2 tip never truly ended. Because every Friday evening, somewhere in the kingdom, another stranger would choose patience over judgment. Another child would share a meal. Another waitress would smile before looking at the bill. And another ordinary act of kindness would quietly begin changing someone else's life. That was the true inheritance Nathaniel Brooks left behind. That was the life Emily Carter chose to protect. And that is how 2 ordinary $1 bills became worth more than all the treasures a kingdom could ever possess.